one of the things we're trying to understand then is like, what is this role where a quiet group member can still be engaged with a group and have influence on the group? What are the ways that they do this? It seems like their moves to regulate the group are very efficient in terms of speech and sometimes are nonverbals.
Welcome to the Emergence podcast, where we discuss ideas that have emerged from collaboration and interdisciplinary work in the physics department at the University of Illinois.
So Professor Katie Ansell is teaching faculty in the Department of Physics at the University of Illinois. Her current work in physics education research focuses on understanding social and cognitive aspects of how groups of students learn to work together and how instructors, near peers, and students navigate the ecosystem of introductory physics labs. She received her BS in Physics and Music from the University of Michigan in 2008 and completed her PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2020. While working on her PhD, she developed a new curriculum for Physics 211 labs that fosters the development of creativity and independent thinking, supported by practical and procedural experimental skills. We are really excited to have Katie on because she directly studies collaborative work, which is something that we're super interested here on this podcast. So welcome, Katie. We're very happy to have you.
So, what happy accidents and strategic choices got you to this point in your career?
Wow, that's a complicated one. There are a lot of moments that I can kind of like pick out little things and then never really had the big picture come together until a few years ago. And it, anytime you're kind of going through your life, you don't feel like any specific thing is pointing you to a place or like, I'm going to do this, but it's like a side project. And so there have been a lot of happy accidents. I actually got started technically teaching physics in high school because I volunteered at a science museum.
Oh, I did that too.
In Miami.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's so fun.
It's so fun.
And it was part of a program. So I was doing an international baccalaureate program and you had to do like 200 volunteer hours. And I was like, well, science is great. And I like people. And the science museum is a mile from my house. So like, let's go, let's do it. Yeah. And so like, that was me getting my foot in the door with actually like teaching people about science. And then I had already decided I wanted to major in physics by then. But I was also singing in a lot of choirs. And I thought, I need to like put that on the shelf and give that up and be serious about doing science when I went to college. And then I realized I could major in music as well. And I was like, and certainly coming from a position of privilege to be like, in 4 years, I can fit this in and I don't feel the pressure to try to graduate early. But within the music major, I learned things like performing arts technology. So I learned audio editing, which is something that I then used as part of my work in my PhD to make instructional videos. Or I learned, I did a lot of musicology classes, which I guess was sort of the precursor to the kind of sociology work that I've gotten into now, where it got me involved in those kinds of conversations with peers, but as a junior and as a senior, so like, and being with the faculty who are valuing your ideas, and so there's like that piece, and then I don't even know. Even it feels like a drift into PER and a lot of happy accidents, right? Like, my partner was very quick at his PhD. We met here in grad school and he finished and we were like, well, what are we going to do? Like the two-body problem is famous.
The worst.
The worst. And so we were like, you know what? Like, we don't want to have to live apart from each other, which also made things complicated because I still had a few years left. And he ended up, his advisor retired that year and his department wanted to hire an aerodynamicist. And they took a chance on him. You typically don't hire someone tenure track straight out of their PhD. But then he got a job here, and we were like, problem solved.
Yeah,
right? And so
that's
then like the second half of graduate school, which was very long for me, and I think that's something we're planning to perhaps come back to later, is that then I could say, hey, we're staying here. Let's figure out how that's going to work, as opposed to being in this vague, like, where can we possibly find an institution that has a wind tunnel, a dynamicist, and also values education, physics departments that value education. And so it was kind of a lot of things where it's like that, like all these little pieces that have clicked together into like where we are and the career that I have and the like weird mixed skill sets. I mean, even that like I took voice lessons in college, and then yes, I'm not singing actively right now, but I spend 4 hours a week in front of a classroom, and I'm, you know, it's like talking to an audience of 200 and it's not exactly the same, but that skill set of getting out and doing the thing and improvising when you need to is all there and ready for me to draw. And so I feel like there's a lot of pieces where it's like, I couldn't have planned this, but it's just so wonderful how it's come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I also know some of my favorite lecturers came from like theater backgrounds because it totally is performance.
Yeah. And I even put on like eyeliner when I teach. It's so funny. Like I know like the whole like women wearing makeup in physics is like a weird thing, but I put on makeup when I teach in part because I'm like, it's kind of like stage makeup because when you're in the back, you can't tell that I have eyes. I'm not wearing intense makeup, but like that's part of it is I'm like, okay, we're going to make it so you can see I have a face.
And I feel like we'll probably get back to this as well, but all those nonverbal cues are so important.
Yes.
And just to be able to see someone's expressions a little bit easier. Yes. Yeah, it's so important. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So now we'll kind of transition to research that we know a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah. So the first question we had, it's just kind of a bit of a clarification question about how you conduct your research.
Sure.
So in graduate school, you designed a lot of curricula for introductory labs to be a little bit more open-ended.
Yeah.
And this question more or less pertains to how you evaluate them. So as a physicist, I work with individual atoms, and the beauty about atoms is that every single one of them is identical. You work with students and people, and the beauty about them is that each student is completely different. So I'm just very curious about how you approach a body of students who are very different and come out with like methodologies to get useful information from like studying interactions between them and all of this. So,
yeah. It depends on what kind of information you're after. And I think it also depends on whether your goal is to evaluate instruction or to build theory and understand phenomena that are occurring. And there is sort of a spectrum of this happening within PER, physics education research, where there is an overlap of assessment, of program assessment. And so actually how I got my start in physics education research was with this program development and assessment. You can't get a PhD in PER just by developing a program. You have to do some assessment. And there are some things where you do try to look at sort of group characteristics. And there are social science norms for certain kinds of statistical tests and assumptions, you know, maybe you can assume that a population is normally distributed across some trait, and then you would use something like the student's t-test. And then there are other skews, and there is a highly quantitative tradition, and that's actually what I got started in part because as physicists, I think we privilege numbers, and we sort of think like, oh, if it's a number, it's real. And so I did get started with that with surveys, with looking at things like if there were impacts on test scores, and doing some things where we were looking at video analysis for certain kinds of behaviors and sort of tallying like, oh, these groups are doing this and these groups are doing these different things. And that was kind of what got me graduated. Since then, I've really focused a lot more on the small scale stories because the kinds of questions that I've been interested in for the longest time, which is sort of coming around these ideas of what are the like special things that groups do that make them so special? It kind of goes in a circle a little, right? Like, you know, as a teacher, when you see a group that is like on fire, I mean, figuratively on fire, of course, like they're like, they've got it. They work so well together. They're asking great questions. Everyone's having a good time. And also the work they're doing is so, so good. It's, a lot of the existing research community is focused a lot on the skills that they're developing without kind of trying to put together this big picture. And skills are very countable, but the big picture stuff, like we don't even understand it yet. And so this, I think, is where getting down to the fine details, looking at individual people or individual sets of groups to say, what is the story here and how can I tell this story is really, really valuable. And like, it's information we lose by converting into numbers.
Oh, that's interesting. So is it like you basically watch students and you kind of end up with basically a set of stories from different groups of different students? And
yeah, and some of those stories rhyme. Okay. Right. And that can be very interesting, and not even trying to say like 5 out of 7 groups do this, but to say, oh, we're noticing this pattern here and we're noticing this pattern here. And it seems like they're similar. So let's latch on to that and try to figure out what the thing is that's similar. Yeah. And then, oh, this is a group that feels really different. Why does it feel so different? So there's still power in contrast, but I'm not sure where this thought is going. So there's power in the contrast, but also we don't want to get so caught up in the counting that we lose that that like, I want to turn this impression that I have into something that is clear to describe and define. Yeah. And so like giving something a name is very important, I think, in education. Actually, one of my colleagues said, Eric Kuo, who's a assistant professor in the physics department and also a member of the physics education research group, what he said is that very good education research seems obvious after it's done. Because it is like things that we can kind of tell are happening, but we don't understand well.
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of along these lines, just to give our listeners a little bit more context, can you talk a little bit about how the cognitive and social emotional elements of group work kind of fit together?
Yeah, so an idea that I have gotten a lot into since last summer that I think ties these together well is the idea of regulation. And so there can be self-regulation, which is things that you do. So planning, monitoring, and assessing to take control of your own cognitive, behavioral, or emotional state. There also can be shared regulation, which happens between people to plan, monitor, assess, take control of their behavioral, cognitive, emotional states. Yes. And then there's also this thing called co-regulation, which happens where there's fluency between self-regulation and shared regulation. So it's not that everything is negotiated by the group, but some people are kind of doing things to take care of themselves or maybe take care of a thing for the group. And then other things are managed at a group level. Okay. And so this does bring in those different factors. And certainly if you are emotionally dysregulated, then you're not going to be able to focus cognitively. Certainly not. And, you bring in things like psychological safety, right? Like if you don't feel safe in your group, you're not perhaps going to participate in a shared regulation to like make sense of the task at hand or to do sense making to say, this seems weird to me. What does this mean? So that to me is kind of the unifying idea. I think there are a lot of ways you can look at it for me. But in general, there are a lot of ways you can look at it, but regulation has been really, for me, the thing that ties all of it together.
Could you tell us a little bit about your current research on quiet students in group work?
Yeah, so this is complicated because nothing I do is just one idea, and that's just part of how I function. So over the past year, I've been looking at old video and doing these comparisons that I was talking about to try to understand what the things are that members of a group do that allow them to function at a high level, to be like really effective groups. And this got started because I promise I'll get there.
Take your time.
This got started because there was something that was happening where some groups were having these very complex conversations where they were weaving together a lot of different topics. And this had gotten my attention and a colleague of mine who's been collaborating with me. And whereas other groups, their decision-making was very, very sparse. So it was like, oh, we're going to do this. Okay. Yep. Write it down.
Okay.
And so as we started looking into this, we started paying more attention to what people were doing to make those happen. And that attention really focused on what we've seen is that a lot of groups of 3 tend to align into a hierarchical structure where there's a leader, someone who we're tentatively calling sort of the collaborator, so the leader and collaborator talk to each other a lot. They do most, like 80 to 90% of the talking in the group. So they're hashing things out. And there's some interesting dynamics with the leader and the collaborator that can come up. And then there's a third person who pretty distinctly does not talk as much. And at first I wasn't paying a lot of attention to them because, go figure, transcript-based research privileges speech. And it was actually Caitlin, this undergraduate who's been doing research with me. I feel like it's with me at this point. She's doing such wonderful work, who really was pushing on this idea of quiet students as something we should pay attention to, and started bringing in this other literature, some K-12 studies, looking at what quiet why students are quiet, but also what they do within groups. And it turns out they can have these really powerful mediator roles. The leader and the collaborator are going at it. And by taking a step back and being out of it, theoretically, these students then can take more of a, I was going to say metacognitive, and I don't want to go into too much jargon, but they're a little more able to monitor their group and apply, I guess, different regulation to the group, where like if 2 people are stuck, if the 2 talking people are just so deep in whatever they're in that they've gotten stuck or have a disagreement they can't resolve, quiet group members theoretically can be tiebreakers. Or if it's taking too long, we just need to move on, they can help pull the group forward in that way. Something also that's an interesting interaction is that for this kind of influence to happen, often there also needs to be some action by the leader who will do moves. So the technical term in qualitative research of like, here's a thing you do that facilitates, and we call it a move, who would do moves that would open the floor for feedback or solicit feedback, which is different. So opening the floor for feedback would be like, I'm going to propose an idea, but when I propose the idea, the point is to get an idea out there so that the rest of the team can add to it. But they can also specifically ask someone like, what do you think? Or do you agree with this? And so there's this role of this leader person to extend influence. And so there are 2 pieces of this research now that I'm working on. One is this what is happening? What is it that the quiet students are doing and quiet group members are doing? I need to be careful about that. Quiet students and quiet group members are not necessarily the same thing. Someone who is talkative could choose to be quiet in a group. That's a role you can take on. So one of the things we're trying to understand then is like, what is this role where a quiet group member can still be engaged with a group and have influence on the group? What are the ways that they do this? It's not captured well in, again, like the traditional transcript-based analysis, because it seems like their moves to regulate the group are very efficient in terms of speech and sometimes are nonverbal. So Caitlin's side of the project this year is to focus specifically on that quiet group member. We're recording videos of groups not right now, but last week we recorded, next week we'll record again in a few weeks, where we want to see this in action again, but this time we're going to be interviewing the group members as well, because we want to understand what they think of the role that they're in, because there is also for quiet group members the potential for marginalization to be happening. There's a lot of reasons a person can choose to be quiet in a group, not all good, or perhaps they're not always choosing, they might be sidelined into it. So we want to understand a little more of that, and also the ways that the quiet group members perceive their participation in the group. And that doing the interviews will help with that. Meanwhile, I'm focusing a little more on this big group structure. And so the things like, how does a person who is in a leadership position in the group, open the floor for feedback? And how does the collaborator take that up? And sort of this, complex system of 3 to understand the whole group, while Caitlin is focusing a little more on the quiet student actions and experience.
It's so interesting that the work is so relational, because you could put 3 people, or you can have 9 people in a room, and if you like slot off 3 of them into 3 separate groups, the groups could be like completely different. You mix them up.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Just to clarify, why is the study focused on triads?
Because that's how we had started. Our what we have hypothesized in the past is that with the lab activities that we have, and this is in a lab context that we're studying, because what we found is that the tasks support much better collaboration compared to like pen and paper problem solving. But what we have kind of hypothesized in the past is that 3 is sort of the sweet spot for having enough members of the group without having the group so large that it encourages social loafing.
Okay.
Which is a technical term for when somebody is not pulling their weight in a group. The like starting study for this had to do with people and doing tug of war. And that people are like, the more people you had on the team, the less force any individual pulled with. This is like research from 100 years ago. Yeah. So that's part of it. I think the other part that we've really focused on triads is that they do invite the structure of 2 people who talk a lot and 1 person who is taking a step back. If you have quadrads, if you have groups of 4, then you have a tendency to pair off. To basically end up with 2 subgroups. Yeah. And of course, if you have dyads, if you have pairs, then they don't have like a third person. And so odd numbers, I think there's something special about that where there's no easy pairing off. And so they support this kind of structure of having that metacognitive, I've taken a step back kind of role.
Yeah, absolutely.
How frequently does this dynamic occur when you have a group of 3 students? Is it like always, or?
I don't know yet.
Okay,
we're working on that. Okay. We have analyzed the old videos we were looking at. We looked at something like 10, and it was pretty clear, I think, in the majority of them, I don't remember the exact number. In the majority of them, it was pretty clear that there was a student who was much less talkative than the other 2. Sometimes it was a little unclear who was in the leadership position, and that often was corroborated with with the groups not being as efficient or well organized. And so and a lot more cooperation instead of collaboration in the groups where there wasn't a clear leader. And so cooperation, meaning we're going to parallelize our tasks. Like you do this, we're not going to talk to each other. Then we'll share our results at the end. Like, well, you do your calculation, but like there's none of this shared aspect.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I've been in group like that before too.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
it's definitely not as fun. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think part of this is just like me being not as familiar with social science, but it seems like triads working together to accomplish tasks is like more insight in that is applicable to so many things, like activism, just a group trying to solve any sort of problem. So how does the discussion between those different like areas of study work in your field?
Not as much as I hope it would. So where I have been drawing from a lot is, like I mentioned before, sociology, and that gets into ideas of status and hierarchy. Also, group psychology or social psychology has been very salient for the work that I do, and education has, go figure, people in education have been studying groups for years when people in physics education research are like, ooh, group work is so hot right now. I say that one of the frustrations that I have within my field is that, and it's gotten much better in the past several years, but because it is physicists who stepped into education, I think there's a bit of epistemic trespass that happens. Sort of this idea of like, we don't need to talk to experts in this. We can just figure it out ourselves.
I could see that happening.
Yeah. And I think, there is sort of a culture within physics of like, we're smart. We can figure out all the things.
Yeah. Yes.
Which can be pretty rough. And so like early PER, for like, which started in the early 90s. So it's a generally young subfield. I think that it didn't draw very much on education. It didn't. I know. I've read the papers. I've seen their citations. There's a lot of self-citing within the not necessarily citing yourself, but like citations within the community. And it's gotten better, but there still will be papers that I will read or review where I'll say, hey, you're only citing PhysRev PER, which is one of the specialized journals, but there's a whole, you know, education has been group work, for example, like group work, this, you know, like this social psychology tug of war thing is 100 years old. There are whole handbooks on group work research that are just like not coming up in things from that people from my community are citing. And so I'm hoping that I can help offer, as part of the work that I'm doing, these frameworks and these insights to bring in these ideas that are not just kind of what we see at the surface, but going a little deeper and building on the expertise and the work of those who've come before us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even as you were kind of just setting up that study, I was like, I feel like I could take insights from this into like friendships, because I have a lot of friendships of groups of 3, and I was like, oh yes, chatty, quiet. That's how it. So that's
and watch out, you're gonna be looking for who's the leader.
I know.
It can switch. There's one of the questions we have this semester is how fluid these roles are, because we think they might be task dependent, and so the videos we looked at before were very much like do the thing with the equipment and writing. But now in the labs, we have them do collaborative writing. And so I have one of the open questions, you know, you're talking about like, how do these things evolve? Like we have a thing we're looking for, we're focusing on. We have a framework that informs what data we focus on. But then there are these little questions of like, well, this is different in a certain way. And like maybe when they switch to writing, somebody else will take the wheel and be like, I am the person who's the strongest at writing. Let's go.
That makes sense.
That sort of reminds me of our dynamic in putting this podcast on together. Speaking of metacognition, because I feel like when we switch to equipment tasks, you are the leader because you're much better at that. But when it comes to like, let's email a million people.
Yes.
I will do that.
Communication.
But like, isn't that also beautiful that when you work in a team, you can like have your preferences and your strengths and like gravitate towards those?
Yeah.
Totally.
Like what a wonderful thing to like be able to respect those and not just be like, well, everyone has to learn how to do the same thing and just like deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We just kind of like, we're like yin and yang.
Yeah.
Like we just kind of balance each other out very well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So yeah, fantastic.
Cool.
So kind of switching gears a little bit. So do you have any suggestions for how to make learning environments kind of generally more inclusive of neurodivergent folks?
Ooh, I like this question. This kind of gets into my teaching side of things. Well, I can start with the group work thing. We'll stay on topic.
Okay,
So group work, I think that I actually went to a seminar series over the summer that was, I don't remember the person who hosted it. I'm so bad at remembering names.
It's okay. We can put it in the show notes.
We should put it in the show notes. I'll look it up. I'll send it to you because perfect. I know she's doing these again. That she's with the university and her background is as a speech therapist, but working with neurodivergent kids. And she did this whole lunchtime seminar series about executive functioning, which is a very useful framework to think about neurodiversity. And one of the things that she talked about is that there are, these like 7 different domains of executive functioning, including things like task initiation, I guess, focus, flexibility. I don't remember all of them. Probably working memory. And like within these, like everyone sort of has some things that they're stronger with and some things they're perhaps not as strong with. But for folks who perhaps are neurodivergent, they might have bigger struggles with certain executive functioning skills. And then the regulation that they need, regulation, has to come from the external supports as opposed to internal supports.
Okay, makes sense.
One of the things that came up during this seminar series was about group work and how a really important thing for neurodivergent folks who are working in groups, the powerful thing they can do is to have a conversation about expectations and supports.
Oh, yeah.
And so this can be for autistic students, it can be for ADHD students, whatever flavor of neurospicy. This idea of let's make sure everyone agrees with the we know what our expectations are of each other, and we also know maybe like what each other's strengths are, and maybe what there's some psychological safety stuff in here.
Totally.
Like you have to feel safe enough to be like, also I have a hard time with this.
Yeah.
And maybe we can support each other as a team. And again, this is something you can learn as you become safe with somebody. Again, with the two of you, when you can be like, I'm having a really rough week this week. Can you pick up a little more slack?
Yes, we have had those chats.
Yeah, right? Like these are things that also benefit neurotypical people. And so something we've started doing in the introductory labs is doing team agreements where we have them have these conversations about expectations. And team agreements are not a brand new thing. Like team contracts, like they can go a lot of different ways, but we really focus on establishing expectations, but then also having a conversation with the team about what kind of support they can give each other. I don't use the word in the document, but like what kind of grace they can extend to each other, right? Based on things that can come up. And so I think that can be one thing that can be helpful. And then to follow up with it, it's, you don't know actually how you're going to work with people till you've done it.
Yeah.
And so we have them follow up in like week 5 or so and ask them to try some new, check in about like, are the conversations fair? Is the division of labor equitable? So that's a thing that can happen at a group teamwork level. In terms of a large class, so I teach Physics 101, which is a class of about 400 students. And it is an executive functioning nightmare because it has so many pieces. There's lecture, there's discussion, there's lab, each lecture has homework stuff that's due the morning before lecture. The lab has an assignment due the morning of lab. There's homework due on Thursdays. It's like if you lined it up just wrong, you would have something due in the class every single day of the week. It's rough. Yeah. And so there are things that I really try to do a lot of universal design for learning approaches with the idea that like if I do something that benefits like our DRES students, if it's already built into the course structure, it will benefit someone else in a way I can't even imagine. And so like some of the things I do is there are the homework deadlines I set up, and there is a homework deadline. Unfortunately, as people are being pragmatic about their time considerations, if there is no deadline, they will not do it, even though deadlines already introduce equity problems. But then I set up a second deadline that's 90% till they have a test on the material. And then I just leave the whole homework open for 70% for the rest of the semester. The idea being that if for whatever reason you mess up the deadline, you're fine.
Yeah.
10% off of a single homework assignment is not going to make or break your grade, but it's enough for you to be like, I should probably do that on time.
Yes.
So that's a weird support of a weird thing because I read Joe Feldman's, he was teaching for equity, and what he asserts is that just deadlines are bad. Like, roll the deadlines. Like there are so many different reasons that a person could miss a deadline.
Yeah.
Neurodivergence, but also like stuff going on in their lives. And I was like, I love the idea, but I don't think that's going to work for the population that I work with. Also, he wrote this in a K-12 context. And so there are certain, things like the students have to come to class. Like they're like, they get in trouble if they're wandering around or not at school eventually. But yeah, so that made me really think about things like the deadlines so that for whatever reason, people can still have that open to them in a predictable way. So that's also hitting on some of the neurodivergence, is that it's predictable. But also then if something happens, there's still that motivation and like that like time crunch that supports task initiation. So that's a big thing. There are other things I do in my class that are not like targeted at neurodivergence, but can help. Like I use auto captioning when I lecture. And I mean, a lot of the ADHD community is like, yes, captions. So like that can help also with like attention, to have that visual cue. I'm trying to think of other stuff, and yeah, I do try to build it in, and certainly I'm more sensitive to sort of the needs of the ADHD community. It's something that I'm working on, is to be a little more mindful of what the autistic students would need. Certainly predictability, I know, and clear expectations. So like I don't change the schedule suddenly. I guess some people do. Those are all great.
And I love the agreements and like kind of like doing the metacognition of like talking about I feel like that's so healthy. And I feel like that's something that's like, I don't know, at least in the mental health community has more so been catching fire the past like 5-10 years. And I feel like that's so healthy, doing it like from early career and academic standpoint.
I mean, even in personal life, honestly, like relationships are relationships.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, there are lots of differences, but like even, it's so silly. There's a lot of stuff I learned within parenting about like setting boundaries that then I'm like, oh yeah, I can also set boundaries when I teach.
Absolutely.
Like, only I was only 37 years old, 38 now, when I learned that like, I'm not talking about this as a reasonable, I'm done talking about this as a reasonable boundary to set.
There's so much that kind of goes back and forth between the personal, professional, because a relationship is a relationship. So, on the topic of relationships, this one's at kind of a bigger scale, but, as sort of we've talked about, part of your dissertation work was improving the introductory labs at Illinois. And so as a result of these, you've been studying culture changes, sort of how like the students, TAs, and faculty interact. What have you learned about culture change in academia from that experience?
Most of my focus has been on the student experience and kind of what they have learned about themselves. And certainly something that has been really encouraging has been to see that they learn how to take on challenges and they notice that they're getting better at it, which is so cool. The teaching community culture, I haven't done research on. There is some research I was doing, some preliminary work, kind of looking at the different ways that instructors position themselves, in the sense of, I believe I'm helping you. What are the different styles of helping? And so there are sort of these archetypes that I've seen. One I call the lawnmower TA, which is just like a lawnmower parent. I'm going to mow down every problem you could ever. I think the most helpful thing for you is to never encounter a problem so you can smoothly get to the end.
Yeah,
which is a great novice move.
A couple times,
And it's like, as a person who has been teaching for more than 10 years now, I'm like, no, that's not good for them because they don't learn how to do hard things. But as a novice, I think that's a natural reaction to say, I don't want my students to be uncomfortable. Right? But it also doesn't give them a chance to do it. It doesn't like give them any agency over what they're doing. And what I've seen when I've observed classes where the TA kind of fits into this archetype is the second the students encounter anything, even later in the semester, they ask for help immediately. They're stuck until they can get help. I've seen others that are sort of the like explainers, right? If I explain it to them clearly, then they'll get it. So it's not, I'm just going to fix it for you, but I'm going to spend a lot of time telling you things. And again, like, it is a well-meant approach, but it's not very effective. And once again, it sort of turns into, we can't figure things out. We need to turn to this person as the source of knowledge. Some of the things that are more interesting is TAs who take on roles that are more of, I'm going to ask you to explain your reasoning, which is much more powerful. And then one of the things that, which is much more powerful, it encourages this sort of overcoming and thinking for yourself and that whole aspect. And then one of the things that can happen in the labs that's a little bit rare, but super cool when it happens, is that when like an experiment has an unexpected result and nobody really knows why, there's this fun little transition of the instructor into a temporary group member.
Oh,
and I have not looked at this one a lot, but like the fact that it exists is so cool.
Yeah.
But like these are these different like levels of like respecting student ideas, but also prompting them to share their ideas and generate their ideas. And I think this is not all lab specific. I mean, certainly the temporary group member, I think, is a lab specific kind of thing. But these other three can be really like, they can happen in office hours. They can happen in, so office hours context would be, is a lot of homework help. It's a lot of students who are like, I am here with this question, help me solve it, which is like, great, yes. And I've been through that evolution too, right? Where it was like, I don't want my students uncomfortable. Like, let's warn them about all the problems beforehand. Or, you know, I went through a very, I'm going to call it cringy stage of like trying to elicit student thinking by saying, well, what do you think? Oh, no. Again, novices mean well, but they're novices.
Yeah.
So like, I'm not mad at me, but I'm a little like, yeah, I've definitely learned how to do this better now. So there's that piece, which is this like in the classroom culture, and it's very influential, right? It influences the students a lot, because if they have some expectation of when they're going to get help, they'll, you know, if they always get help and don't think, they won't get better. And they do get better in the classroom. That is actually a really robust, informal observation, is that in these contexts where we repeatedly ask students to figure things out in a supported way, like, again, not like, here's some random equipment, good luck, but in a well-constrained way, we ask them to figure things out and justify their reasoning. What we find is that, again, this is informal, it's hard to measure formally, is that they start out with a lot of very straightforward, like, how do I do this? What do you want this to be? What are the expectations? Everything's the same conversation. Regulation and expectations. And then they sort of transition to, we're stuck, what do we do? And then they transition to, we're stuck and we have this idea, do you think it's good? And then they can move on to, we're stuck and we tried this and it didn't work. Now can we have some help? Which to me is like a really cool evolution. It's very robust in our labs, that around week 4 or 5, maybe 6, they start to make this transition from to actually like solving problems for themselves.
Yeah, that's really
And it's only when they like get to the end of whatever they're trying that they're like, oh yeah, actually we need you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So that's like part of it. I'm like, it's just some levels of how this works.
Yeah.
It's really fast. I feel like I work mostly as a research assistant in an experimental lab, and I feel like I see that all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's really fascinating.
You get longer with them though, which is just so wonderful. Because like the weird thing about teaching is we like start up these communities and they only exist for 16 weeks. And then we hit reset and start over again. And like, especially from like December to January, it feels like from like May to August, like everyone comes in August with all this energy and it's like, all right, let's go. It's been a minute. But something about like from December to January where you're like, we got to do all this norm setting again. We got to get to know each other, learn to trust each other. Like I feel like we just had it and now we do it again.
Yeah, that's very fair, because I feel like I get to see a lot of undergraduate students become really, really independent. Like it'll go a really, really long time, even like weeks.
Oh my gosh,
I won't see them.
Yeah.
And they'll come back and be like, oh, look, I made this software. It works. Look how nice it is. And I'm like, oh, could you add this?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, and you trust that they know how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm always tempted to fall into the explainer category, but also I feel like I'm always constrained by time. So I need to trust them.
Real talk.
Real constrained by time. Yeah, you are constrained by time, girl. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So this is sort of related to what we're talking about. But this is kind of a two-part question.
Yeah.
One of them is, what can TAs and professors do to give power back to students? Or even the student who's like the leader of the group.
Yeah.
That's another person who could probably give power back to the students. And then the converse question is, do you have any recommendations for students to navigate the power dynamics between them and like a professor and a TA?
Ooh. You're probably going to have to remind me of that second question.
I will remind you of the second one.
Because I ramble and then I forget the question.
It's all good.
Okay, so now I need the first one again. Sorry.
No, you're good. It's all good. So the first one is what can TAs and professors do to give power back to students, or like leaders in a group do to give power to?
Okay. So starting with the TAs and instructors, one of the things that's really important is that, and I think like this is fine and important to acknowledge, is that as instructors, like as an instructor, I do have power over my students. I give them a grade. I'm also in a position of authority as an instructor, which means things like I need to set boundaries and set expectations. But there are ways to, as you're asking, there are ways to use power to support students, to bring, like raise them up. So let's see. I'm trying to think of specific examples instead of just being vague. One of the things that I want to see more is giving students the opportunity to generate more ideas and more connections. That's hard to do in a large course. I'm thinking about this in terms of my students. I don't know how much this is power, like power, influence, status. They're kind of a messy, mixed up. I haven't quite separated them in my head yet. But certainly one of them is like acknowledging the expertise of students. And so like the population that I teach, Physics 101, is a lot of juniors and seniors who are scientists. They're doing research in labs across campus. They're just not in engineering. And so it's very easy for us to come in and say like, oh, well, we are in physics, and in physics we do things this way, and like you're like in an intro class, so I'm going to say treat them like freshmen, which also feels very fraught and icky.
But that resonates,
right?
Yeah, physics definitely has, like, we have our epistemology.
Oh, yeah.
And this is our way. And we often think that it...
And, like, we're going to teach you to think like a physicist.
Yeah.
Which is like, well, okay, like, why is that the best way?
Yeah.
Like, I understand I've been there, but, like...
Yeah.
Like, we're actually asking you to step out of your domain and into ours, but, like, you also, like, do science and are on papers. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a piece. I think kind of on the smaller scale, like as a TA facilitating in a classroom, there's this really great work. So a lot of the stuff that the ways that I think about group work have been influenced by the work of Elizabeth Cohen and Rachel Lotan, who are sociologists. Elizabeth Cohen developed this program called Complex Instruction at Stanford, and then Rachel Lotan took it up. I think she's emeritus now. And this whole program is applying sociology to group work, again, K-12. So much cool stuff has been done in K-12. But within that, there are these papers they have talking about how teachers can confer status on students. And there's two ways to do it. One is by task design, by having things that people can do where their capabilities are valuable to the task. And so that does mean redesigning the kinds of questions you're asking, the kinds of assignments you're giving, right? So that it's not just the pen and paper stuff. TAs don't really have as much power over this or control over this. But that can be a piece of it, right?
Yeah.
Is like giving students choices, giving them multiple points of entry into a task. Another one is to confer status upon, like, one of the things when you have high status as an instructor, again, status, power, authority, there's a lot of meshing here, is that you can value the statements of students that you perceive would be in a lower status position to raise their, like, to, like, lend them status within the group. And this can actually be, it's actually, reading these papers, what the authors argue, it's essential to leveling the playing field and having equitable group interactions is not just that the tasks are designed well, but that the instructors are conferring status to lower status students. What does this mean in principle? I think some of the simple things that TA can do is that if there perhaps is some argument that a student who is more quiet might be lower status in the group. There is some research that suggests that higher status students, and to take a step back, status is conceived, the primary driver of status in the classroom is perceived academic ability, but that is very interwoven with ethnicity and with gender. Yeah. Again, it's perceived. There are papers. Actual academic ability doesn't really make a difference for who is the leader of the group. But typically the person with the highest perceived academic ability ends up, highest status, ends up in a leadership position. So, like, as a TA, you can kind of pick up on if, like, who that leader is. They're the one who's talking to you the most. And so, like, as one move that TAs can make is to ask quieter group members what their opinion is on what's going on, or if they want to add something. And again, it's not just like, do you agree with that? Like, asking a yes, no question is not going to get you a great answer. But that can certainly be a move that TAs can make to confer authority. Or if a student that they have recognized is sort of, again, quieter or seems to be sort of in a marginalized position, like, when they make a good point, they can amplify that and give credit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are all great things, and like relatively, as long as you kind of can perceive, like, the difference.
And I understand for TAs also, like, especially if it's your first year teaching, like, you're so deep in just, like, learning how to do what you're doing that probably you're oblivious to it, because there's only so many things you can pay attention to at once.
Yeah, but once you have a little more time, I feel like that would be like that would be something that people could implement. Yeah, absolutely. And then part two.
Part two is
thank you.
For students who are on the opposite side of that power dynamic, what can they do to navigate it?
What can they do to navigate it?
Do you have any advice?
I haven't been on that side of the power dynamic in 20 years.
Totally fair.
How would I hope they do it? Trying to think at different levels. I think certainly being aware of their rights and advocating for them. Again, like, it's hard. It's I don't want to, like, put it on the people who are in the classroom. Perhaps the students would be, in terms of, because TAs grade them. So in some ways you could argue that the students are in the weakest position. I mean, I guess there are also arguments that in some ways the TAs are. It's weird. It depends on what it depends on what perspective you're taking. Yeah. But, like, in terms of the grading, the students are sort of in the lowest position. And so, like, it's hard to say, I want to put it on the responsibility on them. Because
that makes total sense.
Which is not to say they cannot advocate for themselves, and there do not exist levers for them to, if they have a concern and their TA isn't responding, they should talk to the course coordinator. And if the course coordinator is not responding, like, there's a course head, and if the course head is not responding, they can talk to the department head. How much they do it, I don't know. I mean, that one's hard. I think within a group, it can be, because it's a little closer in status. I think there are some things, it really depends on whether the leader is open to feedback, though, because I've certainly observed groups, and this is looping back to research, where the person who's sort of the second most talking, the collaborator per se, will keep trying to give input or prompt for elucidation and just get shut down with sarcasm. It's so painful. It was so painful. This was a contrast case where we were like, here, there's a leader, a collaborator, and a quiet student. The quiet student is being totally left behind. So the questions they're asking are, what are we doing? And then the collaborator like keeps trying so hard, is like struggling to actually like maybe be the leader. I don't know. But they're not. And none of their ideas are getting taken up. And then they're like trying to self-regulate emotionally by laughing. Right? Like, I'm so uncomfortable that I'm going to like, we're going to be sarcastic and laugh to try to like disperse this feeling. So like these things can happen, and it certainly depends on the openness of the group members to take up the suggestions of others. But I think that for students in groups, I think one of the biggest moves is to say something, right? And like certainly one of the things that students in groups who are having a problem that don't feel comfortable saying something is that they can talk to their TA and have their TA advocate for them. And that's also a tricky thing. And so we have to handle that very carefully. And I've coached TAs on this because when I've been in a lab coordinator position, this has come up sometimes where one of my graduate student TAs will say, hey, I have a student who came to me who, you know, is having a problem with their group. And so it ends up being a conversation that we have of certainly wanting to know what that student wants to have happen. But that is something where the TA can intervene. Like, I think asking it is like, I don't ever want to say like people at the bottom can't make change from the bottom, because grassroots is significant and meaningful and very important. And unions and like there's so many examples of where it's like, yes, it's not that like you're powerless, you can do nothing. But coming from the position of power that I'm in, I feel that it's irresponsible of me to say, well, you should just fix it.
That's very valid. That makes sense.
Definitely. That that kind of resonates. I've kind of volunteered for lots of DEI work throughout my grad program, and sometimes that's like frustrating. It's like, well, there are only a handful of like women in this department, there are only a handful of like Latinas, like and yet like because of that we are the ones that have to make the change. So it's like, well, I don't want to have another job on top of my research.
And it's not rewarded.
Absolutely. So that's a fantastic answer. So because we love collaboration so much on the show, and you have a lot of knowledge in this area, we were wondering what your take is on like an ideal environment for collaboration.
I think it depends on what the collaboration is trying to accomplish. It does need a leader. So like I've talked before about sort of like this sociology perspective and status and leadership, but I think that you do need a good leader, like a person who is kind of the go-to central person for finalizing decisions. Because if you don't have a clear leader, then nobody really knows what's happening. Or if you have more than one person trying to be a leader, then you get pulled into all these different directions.
That makes sense. I feel like that resonates when I've worked on done group projects.
Is there any way to delineate like when you have the two people who are the leader and the collaborator, they both talk a lot.
They do.
How do you sort of differentiate who falls into the leadership role and who falls into the collaborator role?
So generally what we're seeing is that the person who's in the leadership role, people will defer to them for decisions.
Okay.
Okay.
I see. And that's basically the defining characteristic.
That is one of the big ones.
Okay.
And we're trying to understand these sort of archetypes a little more clearly with the current round of work that we're doing. But that is one of the big ones that we look for, is that, you know, kind of like some uptalk to indicate like a question, what, like, you know, maybe the collaborator is like saying something, but they kind of like, you know, do the thing where it's like, it's a question, but it's kind of not, but it really is. Right. And so it will be that like the person who's in the leader position has that final say on sort of synthesizing the decision.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Which, like, again, that is power that can certainly be used to leave people behind.
Yeah.
Or not include other people's ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the, like, whatever they end up saying at the end is the idea that carries forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Again, it's fine. Like, if you're trying to figure out with your friends, like, we're going out for ice cream. And everyone's trying to make a different thing. Like, at some point, somebody needs to be like, we are doing this.
Yes. So two of my best friends, in one of these triads, two of my best friends are very neurospicy. And once we were helping my friend move like a couple months ago. And metacognition task setting. So we were at the beginning of the trip. My friend who's very, very ADHD, she was like, okay, Maddie has the best executive functioning of all three of us. They were like, Maddie will make decisions about the order task needs to be done.
Why not? And it's not like you weren't valuing their input.
No, totally.
Sometimes someone just needs to drive.
Exactly. Yes, someone just needs to drive, and so
I certainly have friends also who are like, "Hey, can I just defer to you? I don't want to make decisions."
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yes. And sometimes I'm just you're just like tired, and you're like, I can't decide right now.
Yeah. Sometimes friends will just be like, decision fatigue. You pick a restaurant.
Yes.
So we're gonna transition a little bit to kind of like outside of not outside of work, but your community of practice that you told us about.
Just could you tell us a little bit about your community of practice around education?
Oh my gosh, it's so good. I love it so much.
That's
so
what we
good.
want to hear.
So good for my professional development. There is a team of 8 now, lab and design instructors who are in various departments across the College of Engineering. I'm the only one in physics, but we've got a couple in bioengineering, biomed engineering. I don't remember the official name of the department. BioE. A couple in ECE. One of them is in mechanical engineering. And we started meeting on a weekly basis during the pandemic. And we're, all teaching faculty and one instructor. And we started meeting during the pandemic. One of the most senior person who's in that group got us together saying, hey, you guys are all people that who seem to kind of be really motivated to do well. And we're all trying to teach these lab and design classes while they're asking us to flip to remote and in person. And it was awful for teaching lab ever. And all these innovations were happening of people coming up with kits to send to their students and coming up with these remote ways to only having one student come in or doing simulations or whatever. And Chris was like, well, we should just talk because we have a lot of common pain points was the term he used. And so we're all trying to solve similar problems. Maybe we can benefit from actually pooling our knowledge and supporting each other. And this grew into a project that we proposed to there's a program in the engineering college called A3. It's the Academy for Excellence in Engineering Education. Got it. Yes. All 3 E's. Yes. Jay's going to be so proud. So we propose they do grants every year for course reform. And we're like, well, we actually want to have some support for this community of practice and to formalize this group. And what we've done since then is we've continued meeting weekly with our core group, which was 6 at the time. It's grown. It's just wonderful. And then we started doing workshops and coffee hours to the lab and design instructor community across the College of Engineering. And so this is something that's continued. I guess we're in our 4th year now. And awesome. We've been submitting papers to the American Society of Engineering Education and kind of doing projects together where none of them are huge research projects, right? We're all teaching faculty. One of the hard things for people who teach lab classes is that they're teaching all the time because lab hours historically are per credit hour. You have double the amount of time in the classroom. And apparently this goes back to some old ideas that time receiving information is more valuable than time doing the thing. Some real old ideas here. but yeah, so like they're spending so much time in the classroom that it's very difficult to like sit down and think. And so having these opportunities to touch base, to even we've had some like little spin-off groups that have temporarily worked on projects has been really, really helpful for troubleshooting, for developing ideas. A lot of us are trying to work on similar things. And so some of the things that we have worked on as a team or as subgroups, there was a year where 4 or 5 of us really sat down to work on group work interventions, and specifically these team agreements that establish expectations, but also orient towards support and repair, which was different from what we were seeing anywhere else. And then the follow-up, was so cool because people were doing this in like senior design classes or, or freshman intro classes, the whole range. And as instructors, we learned that follow-up is really helpful because there's mediating that we can do for when there's an emerging conflict in a group. And usually it's because expectations weren't actually communicated clearly. And so people are frustrated and they're not, for whatever reason, they don't feel comfortable. They don't feel like they have the power to bring this up. And so like the instructor of like this design course was like, yeah, the groups that were having trouble, we talked and we figured it out and it got better. It's like, yes, yes. So there's that. There's a project that we've been working on that's been a little more, I guess, DEI. I mean, there's all DEI, right? Like, but looking at accessibility of labs across the college and starting with just a survey to understand largely accessibility from a physical disability perspective to start, because there are a lot of ways you can consider accessibility. It's not very good is where we've gotten so far. Okay. So the first step is to understand what's happening so that we can address specific problems. And so that meant surveying students who were in these courses. And then I think one of the next steps is focus groups to understand, again, the specific experiences and stories, because like when you like put everything aggregated, you lose like, the way we've set up these tables for a person who is using a wheelchair, now they can't reach the equipment. Or, one of the big ones that we became aware of is that for courses that use resistors, that do circuits, they're not colorblind friendly. Oh, right? And little tiny stripes. For one, they're rough for low vision anyway, but they're also not colorblind friendly. So folks who are colorblind can't always read the resistor codes. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, what do we do? Well, we can get magnifying glasses. That's easy. But also maybe we need like good like multimeters, and then you stick it in and it reads it, and you don't have to, like, it's universal design again too, right? This is going to benefit us in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. I hate reading the resist. I can read them. Yeah. Having a multimeter to just put the
just stick it in, like
let's ditch these little weird bands.
Right? It's cute, but like, and I'm sure there are probably some places where they're like, yes, this is an important skill to learn, and like, fine. Physics 212, I don't think so, right? Like, if they really need it for their like professional life, they will get it again later on in a class. Another project that we've been taking on lately is really supporting within our community on TA training, which is not that we want to, as a community, provide TA training, but to understand how to be better leaders of teaching teams.
Okay. Yeah.
Because like us being like, oh, graduate students, we want 4 hours of your time. It's going to change everything and make it better. Not realistic. It's course directors who have the main contact with their teaching teams. And so that's a really, I think, promising point of entry to say, no, we can learn to be better leaders of our teams and establish expectations and support professional development and all these things. And so that's a project that we're growing this semester. Actually, just last night we submitted the abstract. So I guess we're going to work on that paper. One of the ways you can make yourself do the work is to submit the abstract for the conference and be like, well, we got to give that presentation in the summer. So
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, that sounds really, just like super productive. And I'm glad that you guys have like found that group. where you can just kind of like support each other and learn from each other and build off each other. Yeah.
We're also very neurospicy in this group. So like sometimes the conversations are like, we were talking about making stickers last week. It was amazing. You can make stickers at the Siebel Center for Design and they're like cheap and it like cuts them. See?
Really?
Yeah. See, I'm like, I want to make stickers.
Podcast merch.
I want to have my daughter like draw pictures and I want to make stickers of them. I think it will be super fun.
That's the best. Okay.
She was like, I want to draw my friend and her family and then give her a sticker of herself.
I love that. Oh my God. If I showed up to my friend's desk and had made stickers of their cats, they would lose their minds.
Wow. Look it up. There's like a short little training you have to do on Canvas and then you're authorized. You just have to make it all the way down to the Siebel Center for Design.
She's far. She is
link
very
far.
Link in
the description.
Yes, link in the description. Stickers to come. Stickers to come.
That's a promise.
And that's a promise. It's on air, so now we have to do it.
Yeah.
What are some just kind of like general goals you have for yourself professionally for the next like 5 years, like near future?
Yeah, I really am excited to see this project that I'm working on grow. Since I started in the position that I'm in, it has taken me a while to sort of figure out what research looks like for me. One of the things has been that I have more time to do it in the summer when I'm not teaching.
Yeah.
And I've spent the past few years, I think, I will talk about the future, but I have spent the past few years kind of learning with therapy, to stop, like to not fight myself as much, but to really lean into structures that work for me and to, instead of being like, suddenly I'm going to be this person who can like teach, but then also do like all this research during the semester. I think that it's much better. I think that I'm starting to fall into a pattern that is serving me of, obviously I have to collect data when students are in classrooms. But the bulk of that work can be done in the summer where I can chunk out my time and kind of do some of that deep work. Because if I only have like 30 minutes here or there, it's just not going to happen for me. The task initiation is so challenging, right? And so now that I'm starting to figure that out and I'm in year 5 of my position, I think that I'm starting in the next 5 years looking at building up a little more of the research program, kind of getting that moving, figuring out what that pace is, where it started out as nothing because I was doing more course reform actually in my first couple years. Well, first it was the pandemic and then course reform. So there wasn't really a lot of time to do research because of all the other things I was doing as part of my job. So yeah, figuring that out, getting that moving. I'm excited to see this project on teamwork grow. Because there's a lot in here that I think can help us respect different students better and certainly inform instruction as well. I'm excited to see our community of teaching faculty grow in the next several years. And that's something that I feel responsibility towards and responsibility towards our teaching community in general. And so I think in the next several years, I've started doing a lot of work to at our introductory level courses to support our lab instructors in particular, but to have these ideas of not just like you work with your course team, but we have a community that we're working together. That's something I'd like to see grow. It's really hard to figure out. I think in some ways, I'm thinking in the next 5 years, I also need to kind of find a level where I'm not always doing like big changes to courses. Because like this semester, for example, for me is very busy because of some choices that I made. And when I made those choices, I knew what the consequences would be. But I'm also like, all right, this is week 6. I got to do this for another 10 weeks. So I need to make sure that I think finding in the next 5 years, I'm hoping to find a pace that is doable for me in the sense of I can maintain my boundaries of not working at night or on the weekends because I want to spend time with my daughter. And also I'm a human who is not just a worker.
Wonderful boundaries to have.
I mean, this is part of the privilege of having chosen to be in a non-tenure track position is that I feel a lot more confident setting those boundaries. while also being like, yes, I do good work. So it's fun. Like,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's hard for me to have a coherent picture. So yeah, building up the research, getting that kind of work out there more, building up the community of teachers. I think understanding kind of across the college too, sort of like this community of practice model, and that community also has been kind of like, so what is our long-term goal? What is our future? Because part of what keeps us together is the legitimacy that being on even a small funded program gives us, right? Because it requires that we meet weekly, but also it's a really nice item on the CV when it's time for promotion.
Absolutely.
Thinking about that way is kind of like, but also we kind of have to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait, where was I going? Okay, so community, understanding what that means, and also maybe what that means for like other pop-up communities in the college. A strength that I have is synthesizing ideas and like going out and getting these ideas from these different disciplines. I'm really wanting to find a way to get those ideas to my community in sort of the community accepted ways. And so that means figuring out over the next few years, sort of the structures that work for me for getting publishing done.
Yeah.
Writing is easy once you get started. Easy. I can do it once I get started, but it's hard for me to get started. And that's another one where I have to chunk out my time.
Yeah.
Can't get good writing done in 30 minutes. No.
No.
But yeah, so I'm looking forward to like finding these things that work for me and kind of leveling it out and not becoming complacent. Like I think there's always going to be something new to do, some new idea to try in a classroom, new questions with research, certainly new students to be working with. And one of the rich things about working with students is they also bring in their backgrounds and strengths and experiences and the perspectives that they bring allow us to ask new kinds of questions. So yeah, I guess like more of the same, but like maybe a little less chaotic.
Yes. Yeah. That's fantastic. I hope that these goals pan out for you. But I think that resonates with lots of like early career folks, even if they're not like in the same position that you are. So yeah,
for sure. So we've talked about 5 years in the future. Now I want to go back into the past. And you have experience taking a little bit longer with your PhD, and I'm wondering if you can draw on your past experience to give advice for people who are taking a little bit longer.
I have a friend who's in this position, and something that I've told him, and he's like getting ready to defend. So like that's the best place to be in.
Yeah.
When you're like, when it's longest to be like, okay, I'm gonna get out. This is the exit plan. Is that once you're in your career, like in that position that's like out of grad school, nobody cares how long it took for you to be in grad school.
That's
like
such good perspective.
Nobody cares. Like I'll say it took me 12 years to finish grad school. Way longer than like anybody else I know. But nobody cares now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Like even the people who know, they don't like, because I've been in the physics department. Like some people know, they're like, you've been here forever. And I'm like, yes.
It's working great.
And I also know that I have your respect as a teacher. Like that like from talking to some other colleagues, they're like, oh yeah, like people really like, I feel like now I'm bragging on myself, but they're like, yeah, no, like people really like respect, like you're like, you know what you're doing. You're like lead the courses well. And I'm like, yes. Yes. Good. So no one is here being like, oh yeah, she just stayed here and became permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, and again, like that's hard to believe because when you're in it, it feels, well, in some ways grad school is quite comfortable, but it also like there's shame on like taking a long time. Like it's comfortable in that you have so much control over what you're doing. And over your time in a way that I didn't really appreciate until afterwards. I mean, maybe I did a little bit. No, I did a little bit. I also had a baby during grad school because I was like, okay, this is actually pretty easy to figure out when you're a grad student.
Yeah.
As faculty, it's like, okay, now teaching release. Do I get teaching release? Do I like, how many weeks off can I take? What will happen to my progress? Will I get promoted? I mean, there are structures, right? Like for people who have babies, they can push back their tenure clock, for example. But it's different. It's like more pressure, which I'm not saying everybody should have a baby in grad school. But when it was taking a long time, I was like, okay, I'm 30. we should probably do this thing.
Yeah.
There's no good time. Let's go.
Yeah.
I don't know. Let me think more.
Yeah. Take your time. Take your time. Yeah.
Maybe things taking a long time can be a signal to think about what's happening and what is or isn't working well. I think there also can be issues that happen where advisors are not exactly supporting their students in the ways that they should, perhaps not intentionally. I want to give the benefit of the doubt. They can be things like you think you're going to graduate on this project, but then your advisor is like, oh, I can't like afford for you to graduate. I need the expertise to stay in the lab. So like, actually your project is this.
Yeah.
That kind of thing can happen. And I've seen it happen. I guess for me, to some degree that happened where I had a certain project. Like when I prelimed, it was on a reasonable scale project. And then for, which like that prelim was for looking at working with like virtual materials versus hands-on materials. But then an opportunity came up and then like this whole course reform thing. And one piece of advice I do give graduate students is don't do course reform. It is not, it's not an appropriate job for a grad student. It is way above your pay grade. It can be very enticing, but like it takes so much time and it's not work that you can graduate on. Burnout is real. I would say also like there are great therapy resources around town and the grad student insurance is decent. I mean, I know the wait lists are ridiculous these days, but like certainly not pushing through burnout and like seeking out support for that is a big one. And I know there was a lot of time when I was really burned out as a grad student, and perhaps because it had taken so long and I was like so deep in it, I felt like I could never take breaks because I was like, I have to finish. I need to finish someday. What if like I can't take vacation? That's a big one. And I think there probably are some questions of like, I don't know, just like getting to know yourself and not to say, oh, there's something wrong with you, because never, ever do we want to have that kind of discourse because there's already enough shame that can happen with this, like being a long time in graduate school. But I mean, there may be some questions about like, what structures do you have in your life, in your work life, with your advisor that are or aren't supporting your success? And that can be something to really explore. In a kind and curious way, as opposed to a way that invites blame and shame, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate your input.
I will say also doing other projects does slow you down.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe that's also part of accepting it. Like I taught at a private middle school for a couple years while I was in grad school. It was part-time. Yeah. But that was 8 hours of my week or 12 hours, just like gone to something else. And to loop back around to the first question though, like there is something when you finish, when you get out, when it doesn't matter anymore, where you're like, oh, I think it's really good that I had that experience. Yeah. Like me teaching my own class in a private school where I could kind of do what I wanted, as long as I didn't make the parents mad. But also shout out to Campus Middle School for Girls. Very cool place. That was my first chance to really kind of find my teaching voice, because that was my first chance to be in a class where I made the decisions about what happened and what we were going to focus on and how we were going to do it. And it was so fun. Campus Middle School is this all-girls, very small school. I think, the biggest class I had was 13 and the smallest was 9. Yeah. And you're teaching like the whole 6th or 7th grade of like 9 students, and they're very close to each other and they're very motivated and curious, and to engage with people with physics or physical science at that level, but physics, and to bring in all the things that were exciting about it to me and my access to resources, and then to be able to answer their questions and challenge them to think hard about it. Like middle school is such a funny age because like they think they're adults and they're not, which is a whole thing. But also they're old enough to think in more complex and critical ways, but they're also young enough to kind of go along with you on stuff.
Yeah.
And I loved that so much. But that really informed my teaching philosophy and my teaching style, so that actually then following that was when this lab reform thing came up. And so like everything ties together. So I'm like, yes, that slowed me down and paid for my wedding a little bit. And also, yes, that was really formative for me as an instructor. And now that like I am a teacher, like I'm a teacher and a scientist, but right, like I'm a teacher, and I'm so glad I had that opportunity to figure out like who I am as a teacher when I'm not in a really rigid system where here are the materials, facilitate your students through them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I really loved hearing about like all the things that have fed into you being a teacher, like singing, the middle school like experience, all of these things that are not necessarily like college level physics teaching. I think it's been really wonderful hearing how they've all kind of fed into the work that you're currently doing.
Yeah, nothing was a waste, which is like things feel like it sometimes, but then I'm like, no, I feel so lucky in my life that none of it has been a waste.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Even like in your professional life as a scientist, as a teacher, you're made up of so many components.
Yeah. And I love that my job now allows me to access those different components, not all the time, but that's kind of part of what makes it really fun for me, is that like some days I'm a teacher. Some days I'm a scientist. Some days I'm kind of straddling. Some days I'm a graphic designer. And it's so fun. Like, talking about being neurospicy. I'm like, you know what? Like, it turns out I am happy in a job that is different things on different days.
Yes. Yeah. Sweet. So we have one last question for you. So in physics, emergence is used to describe a behavior which occurs at large scales but not at small scales. So in other words, in an emergent system, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For example, when blackbirds flock together, the group will kind of move and bend in a way that the individual bird doesn't. So can you give us an example of emergence from your work or just like your professional experience?
Something that professionally and research related that's been really cool is being a member of the physics education research community and seeing how that community has grown and changed over the past several years as I promise this is like this emergence thing, like different people are trying these different approaches. They're reaching out into things like critical theory and critical research methods, which are more like, let's look at the structures with an eye to change them. There's a lot more things like participatory action research, which is really like very different from these very like Western, you don't get involved in the research, like these different paradigms of research that are more justice oriented. And meanwhile, there are these themes that emerge within, again, it is, I think any field sort of has these things happen, but I think because PER is still relatively young, like the cycles of it are different. And maybe because education is so broad. But like this theme of group work, which I have landed on. Not landed on. Not even drifted into. I think I've been like going there all along and didn't really know until I like really got there. Is something that has become really important in our community. And it's not because any one person said, now we care about this, but because a lot of different instructors, a lot of different people teaching and interested in teaching and learning of physics really started to pay attention to it around the same time. I think, one of the things is like the pandemic really kicked things into high gear for like group work and how hard it was to work in groups over Zoom. Although it was starting to grow before that. And so it's been really cool to see like that kind of research, but specifically with these alternative research methods growing. And so like that this thing has emerged, right? Like this, like lots of different people who are working on the same theme, but in a lot of different ways. And so it's not like, oh, this is the one group work person or the one group work in labs person, but to say, oh, this person is really looking at more of the numerical aspects of it. And so it's cool that they can contribute in this way, and I can contribute in this very like down to like telling the stories. And then this person can contribute in this like sense-making way. And so it can all come together into this big, growing group of ideas for both the education research community, but also the sort of the practitioner community. Mm-hmm. So I think that might be, I mean, I don't know to the scale of a flock of birds, but like the way that these themes have grown and like led to culture change. And there's certainly, and even to the point of the culture change within physics education research of attending to feelings. 10 years ago, it would be like, feelings? No, it's just
physicists usually don't love.
Right. I want facts, not feelings. Like,
but actually,
turns out,
the same sometimes.
Yeah, I know. It matters, right?
Yeah,
but like that
matter.
growth of like feelings matter, how people work together matters in so many ways. Like seeing that emerge has been very cool in the 12 years I've been in this community.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, I'm really happy to see that, because especially like at an R1 institution, just to see that like there are people in the department who are really passionate about teaching and who are like taking it in like a more like justice oriented direction is really fantastic. And I feel like we're very fortunate to have that here, because I know pals at other R1 institutions where it's not the case. So so thank you for sort of being being a generator of that change. Absolutely. And
I'm very privileged to be in a department that supports it as well. There's definitely things that I'm like, there are other schools I would be at that would not let me do what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and chatting.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's super fascinating to hear about your work and your experience.
Really awesome.
I'm just
and
like,
stickers.
My brain is stickers.
For further readings and resources about the topics covered in today's episode, check out the links in the description. Thanks for listening and stay connected.